tonight's debate, the Socratic Club is proud to be in its 13th year of service to OSU and the surrounding community, and we hope to continue for many more years. To the returning audience members here tonight, thank you for your continued interest, ongoing support, and insightful questions. If this is your first Socratic Club event, welcome and thank you for joining us. We hope you'll attend more debates in the future. The OSU Socratic Club organizes religious debates and dialogues between scholars for the benefit of OSU and the surrounding community. The club was first founded in 1941 at Oxford University with C.S. Lewis serving as its first president. The club was first founded in 1941. Just read that. Our mission is to provide an open forum for the discussion of intellectual difficulties connected with religion and with Christianity in particular. More information on the club and some free essays are available in the lobby. Please feel free to stop by and talk to any of us after tonight's debate. Our Facebook is another great resource for information and also includes a link to our YouTube channel, which features videos of many previous debates. The goal of tonight's debate is to analyze the relationship between Christianity and environmental stewardship. Specifically, our speakers will address the question, is Christianity a help or hindrance to sound environmental stewardship? The structure of tonight's debate is as follows. Each speaker will be given 5 minutes to speak in defense of his chosen position. Next, there will be 20 minutes of discussion, during which the speakers may give questions of one another. Questions will then be taken from the audience for about 35 minutes. Those 35 minutes tend to pass quickly, so I suggest forming your questions carefully and perhaps writing them down in the space provided in your programs during the debate. We will try to close by 9 o'clock with a 3 to 5 minute closing statement from each speaker. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lauren Wilkinson. Dr. Wilkinson is a professor of interdisciplinary studies and philosophy at Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he has been on faculty since 1981. His teaching interests include Christianity and the arts, philosophy, and earthkeeping. In the course of his career, Dr. Wilkinson has published both popular and scholarly articles on a wide range of topics, including Christian environmental ethics and the environmental, scientific, and religious aspects of the human relationship with the natural world. His books include Earthkeeping, Christian Stewardship of Natural Resources, and Caring for Creation in Your Own Backyard, a book he co-authored with his wife. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Wilkinson.
I have not yet turned my machine on.
Yes. I'm very grateful to the Socratic Club for inviting me down here from Canada tonight to talk about this hugely important topic. And that's not, for me, just a conventionally polite introduction. I grew up, because in a deep sense, when I'm coming here, I'm coming home. I grew up on a farm along the St. Anne River, which flows into the Willamette, a few miles north of here, as you know. I went to high school in Albany. Corvallis was our most serious rival back then. I came here a lot for track and cross-country meets and speech and debate tournaments. So it's a privilege to come back to Corvallis and to Oregon State more than half a century later. But I mention that boyhood along the St. Anne River for a reason more relevant to our conversation tonight. And that conversation concerns the sources that we draw on as we think about our treatment of the earth. When I try to identify those sources in my own life, two influences stand out. One is being born into a Christian family, growing up thoroughly shaped by the broad outlines of the Christian story. That we live in a universe which is the good gift of a loving Creator God. That the clearest picture we have of that Creator is through the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. I'll return to that story and its implications for our relationship to the earth in a little while. But as I've said, that story, and when I use the word story, I don't mean story as opposed to something that's true, but a true story, a narrative in which our life can find its meaning. That story is informed my thinking and my writing and my teaching about the care of creation. And I believe it provides the solidest foundations for our actions towards the earth. But that relevance of Christianity for our life on the earth wasn't very obvious to me then. So that first central influence from my childhood was pretty disconnected from that other main influence, which was the place itself, that farm and forest I grew up in along the St. Anne River. Among my earliest memories are wandering on deer trails through that still intact ecosystem. But also among those earliest memories are following my father down into the woods behind our old decrepit Alice Chalmers Caterpillar tractor on homemade logging roads. I come from a family of loggers. Our business was to work hard cutting down the forest and turning it into fields. I grew up in a pioneer culture. Oregon is, or at least was when I was a boy, a state which glorifies the pioneer experience. Have you ever looked closely at that golden figure on top of the state capitol in Oregon, in Salem? It's a muscular pioneer, astride a stump, holding an axe. The last of the old-growth Douglas fir on our family's farm was finally cut down to help pay for my college education. And at college, near Chicago, a long way from Oregon, I began to get a bigger view of creation, began to appreciate its vast age, the processes that had produced the mountains and the forests that I loved, the complexity of the relationships of living things to each other and to their place. I began to see that what we call evolution was not opposed to creation by a living God, but a way of describing the slow action of God in shaping the biosphere. And I began to connect those two stories, the Hebrew and Christian story, told in the Bible in terms of older science and cosmology, and the new story of creation being unfolded by science, and to see them as part of the same story. And I want to be clear that when I use the word creation, as I'm going to, as a synonym for nature or the environment, I'm not assuming the cosmology of the ancient Near East, which was the framework for that poetic six-day story of creation in Genesis 1. But the thing that that account is saying about the relationship of creator, creation, and ourselves. If that story were written today, the account would be framed probably in terms of current cosmology. But the truths it would communicate about those relationships would be the same. And I'll talk about those truths in a little while. So in many ways, my whole time since leaving this Willamette Valley half a century ago has been spent trying to figure out how to connect those two influences. The experience of a loving God and the experience of the goodness, wildness, and beauty of the created world, which we can also describe as the biosphere, or the environment, or nature. In about my second year of graduate school, the medieval historian Lynn White gave an address to the American Academy of Science, which was later published as the influential essay, The Historic Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. In it, White attempts to provide one answer to that question. What does Christianity have to do with the biosphere? And we were asked to frame our discussion tonight in terms of that hugely influential essay, which is over 50 years old, almost 50 years old now. How many have read that essay by Lynn White? Are you familiar with it? Not that familiar. It still shows up in anthologies everywhere. Evaluating his answer to that question, what does Christianity have to do with the environment, is one of our main tasks tonight. I began with a little autobiography because for none of us, whatever our religious or philosophical background, can this question of what White calls our ecological crisis be merely academic or theoretical. All three words in that phrase of his title, our ecological crisis, are important. Ecological, certainly. White wrote shortly before those first photos from space which showed us a living blue and white earth in stark contrast to the lifeless horizon of the moon. Today, hardly any thoughtful person is unaware that we live in an ecosphere, a planet of life, unique in the solar system, perhaps unique in the whole universe. And if the state of that living planet evoked from White the word crisis in 1967, that word, crisis, is much more appropriate today. Still, for us, the most important word in White's title, Historic Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis, is our. The environmental crisis is indeed our problem, and our conversation here tonight would be a failure if, in answering the main question, is Christianity harmful or beneficial to the environment? That's one of the forms in which I saw it advertised. We diverted attention from our own moral responsibility to deal with the crisis that White talked about in his famous essay. I suspect that Alan and I agree that the important thing tonight is not to win an argument, but to become clearer about how and why we should care for the earth. So let me move quickly to the heart of that thesis by Lynn White. His argument, it seems to me, has three parts. The first is that the state of the planet is bad and getting worse. I can only agree. As I said, the word crisis is much more appropriate now than when White wrote back in 1967. Back then, when the parts per billion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was only about 320, not much above the 280 it has been through most of human history, he wrote prophetically that our present consumption of fossil fuels threatens to change the chemistry of the globe's atmosphere with consequences we are only beginning to guess, he said in 1967. Now that composition has increased in my lifetime from 320 parts per billion to 400. It's going up about 2 per year. And we no longer have to guess at the consequences. Among them are the accelerating acidification of the ocean, and one of the greatest periods of species extinction in the history of the planet. The second part of White's argument is that the rapidly deteriorating state of the biosphere is the direct result of a union of science and technology, which is a uniquely Western development. Here too, I don't find much to disagree with in White's argument, but I do want to question some of the assumptions that lie behind those words, science and technology. The third part of his argument is the one that concerns us the most tonight, because it takes us into the really important topic of the evening, which is not really White's argument, but how and why we should act in this state of planetary crisis. And it really has a double point. The first is that Christianity is mainly responsible for this union of science and technology. The second is that because of the disastrous effects of that union of science and technology, Christianity, in his words, bears a huge burden of guilt for the current state of the planet. Now, White packs a lot into this final point, and I think that some of it's true, and some of it's partly true, and some of it's simply false. So let me unpack his argument a bit. The unequivocally true part of his argument is that science is, in part, a legacy of Christianity. I say in part because the history of science is very complicated indeed. And here White isn't a very good guide. He implies that modern science grew directly by a slow process of development from Greek sources. Now, Greek and later Islamic scientists were very good at mathematics. We are forever in their debt. But as you know, by the way, how many of you are in the sciences? Just out of curiosity, more than about half of you. As you know, especially, mathematics is only one part of science. The other part is observation, paying careful attention to a world which keeps surprising us. You don't even need a real objective world to do mathematics. It deals with an ideal world. And we could argue about that, but we won't. So science had to free itself from the old Greek notion that the world was an imperfect copy of ideas which existed perfectly in some eternal realm, perhaps the mind of God. before modern science could really begin, we had to learn to pay attention to the way the world was, not the way we thought it should be. This was made clear back in the 1930s in an important series of articles by the Oxford philosopher M.B. Foster, published in the British philosophical journal Mind. Their overall title was The Christian Doctrine of Creation and the Rise of Modern Science. His conclusion is important both for our understanding of White's argument and for the far greater purpose of understanding the springs of our own action towards the threatened biosphere. First, said Foster, the God that we meet in Hebrew and Christian scripture is not bound by rational necessity, but is free. He does what he wills to do. A more familiar description is that this is a God of love. The second part of Foster's argument is that the Christian view of creation is the result of this free character of God. Thus, creation, the universe, is contingent. That's a fancy word which means that it's not necessary or predictable. It's full of marvelous things, from galaxies to rainbirds to hummingbirds to human beings, and none of them have to be. It's a surprise. It's not necessary. And third, if creation is thus contingent, if you couldn't imagine it by sitting back and thinking about it, if it is surprising and unpredictable, the work of a free and loving creator, then the only way of knowing that created world is empirically. We can't sit back and think about it. We have to go out and look at it. Science, therefore, must be empirical, based on paying attention to things before it can be rational and mathematical. Lynn White, largely in his essay, misses this truth, that the essential roots of science are not only in the universe's law-like behavior, which can be described mathematically, it's also, crucially, in appreciation of the contingent nature of the universe, its ability to keep surprising us, its nature as a gift. And of course, a gift implies a giver. Since creation is, as White rightly recognizes, a kind of book written by the Creator, we should pay attention to it. Not so it can tell us what we already know, but so it can open up to us the inexhaustible character of the Creator God. Creation is thus of value for itself, not for its human usefulness. To be sure, all creatures, plants and animals included, have to use their world in order to survive. We humans are no different. But White is quite wrong, it seems to me, in implying that those medieval Christians he wrote about were somehow unique in applying their technological ingenuity to their needs. Humans everywhere have always done that with whatever tools they had. The rest of the natural world has suffered because of it. On every continent, there's strong evidence that when human beings first showed up, the large, slow-moving sources of meat, from mammoths to moas, disappeared shortly afterwards. And for further example, the inhabitants of Mesopotamia and many parts of Asia managed to reduce their land to near desert through grazing, irrigation, salinization, and overcropping. All this human damage was done way before Christian ideas of human dominion. So the problem is not with Christianity, it's with being human. The fact that science flourished first in Christian nations and thus became available to those people to increase their power over the earth is true, and it's regrettable. But the problem is not with science or with the Christian story itself. It's rather the result of Christians failing to live up to the truths of what they say they believe. So let me spend the rest of my time sketching for you what I think I've discovered in that half-century since I left that farm in the Willamette Valley about what the Christian story does imply about our relationship to the earth. For I do think it's a help and not a hindrance in our care of the earth. My purpose here is both to explain some foundational Christian ideas and to answer what seems to me the most serious mistake in White's argument. Serious both because it's flatly wrong and because it's the one part of his important essay which is most widely remembered and accepted. White says, in summary of the biblical creation story, that in his words, quoting White now, God planned all of this for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes. And sometimes Christians and whole Christian cultures have acted that way, but it's breathtakingly wrong as a summary of the Christian story and biblical teaching. So let me briefly sketch what I think is a more accurate Christian view in terms of 6 propositions. First, the universe is best understood as creation by a personal being outside the universe. There really are only 2 options when you think about it. Either the universe is a purposeless accident, or it was created with a purpose that's consistent with personhood, consistent with the kind of discussions of morality that we're having here tonight. Second, creation is good. Not, as for example in much Eastern thought, a wheel of painful change in which our only hope is to escape from the physical. And it's good in and for itself, not just because it's useful to us. Since this idea directly contradicts White's widely believed claim that physical creation has no purpose save to serve man's purposes, it's his words, I need to dwell on that a bit. The clearest evidence for this, oddly enough, is that this is not all made for man, is hidden in the numerological symbolism of the Hebrew creation story. Hebrew culture gave an exalted place to the number 7. But Adam, the word means humanity, male and female, is made, as you recall, not on the 7th day, but on the 6th, along with the rest of the animals, to which, as the story implies, he's thus clearly related. The 7th day is reserved for the Sabbath, not for man. A Sabbath is a time of rest. The Hebrew word is shalom, a peace in which humans, animals, and the Creator rest in harmonious relationships. A third thesis: human beings are both creatures, like everyone else, animals, like everything else, and they have a special place in creation. They're both ordinary animals, part of the rest of the, like every other creature, share DNA with everything else, every other living thing, and they are special. Their commonality, their earthiness, is dramatically expressed in the Hebrew pun behind the word Adam. Adam, mankind, is made from Adamah, earth. It's like saying humans are made from humus. But our specialness is clear as well. These same creatures of dust are made, as the account goes, in the image of God. What that means and does not mean, I will discuss in a moment. They're given dominion over other creatures. And this is not said of anything else in creation. Now, this specialness of the human and the concept of dominion is widely understood as having given unlimited license for humans to use the earth for their purposes. This is a mistake. But we should not dismiss the idea of human specialness too quickly. This was brought home to me many years ago when I had the privilege of attending the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. It was convened, as you recall, to talk about the health of the planet and its 10 million species of living things. But except for a few stray birds and parasites, only human beings attended. It was the Earth Summit, but the whales didn't come, the trees didn't come, only human beings came. It's as though we humans were and are the voice and consciousness of the earth. We do mess up the earth like no other creature. And modern science and technology vastly accelerates our ability to do that. We also seem to be the only creatures who know and care about this. And here, our science and technology is a great aid. But we are undeniably different. Fourth, the form that human dominion is to take over the earth is care. What dominion and rule might mean is spelled out in the second creation story, in Genesis 2. Adam, in the biblical story, is placed in a garden, told to tend it. The Hebrew word is the same as the word for serve, and he is to keep it as well. The word is used later in the Bible in a famous blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Evidently, we are to keep creation as God keeps us. Fifth, the whole biblical story can be understood as a series of painful lessons about what it means to be in the image of God. It means not to lord it over each other or other creatures, but to love and care for them. The central example of this pattern of self-giving love for others is Jesus, the supreme example of the love which is the source and sustaining energy of the universe. Now, curiously, Lynn White knew this and said it clearly. At the end of his article, he points to St. Francis of Assisi, that remarkable medieval radical who did so much to help his age recover what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. He disdained wealth, cared for the poor, and was remarkably open to non-human creatures. He did this in imitation of the Creator God revealed in Jesus, who, and these are White's words, in the ultimate gesture of cosmic humility, assumed flesh, lay helpless in a manger, and hung dying on a scaffold. White calls Francis the greatest spiritual revolutionary in Western history. But, and here is White's greatest mistake, shared by many Christians today and throughout history, he fails to recognize that the pattern of service, humility, and self-giving, which Francis represents, is not, as he implies, an aberration, a heresy. It is the basic attitude of self-giving which lies at the very heart of the gift of creation. And it is seen most clearly in Jesus, and is thus at the heart of a genuine Christianity. It's certainly an attitude which the world needs today. And White recognizes this when he proposes, in the concluding sentence of his essay, that St. Francis be viewed as the patron saint of ecologists. White doesn't mention that it was this very attitude of humility and openness to the natural world that nourished the early movement of empirical science, but that's another much longer story. My sixth and final point, and I beg your indulgence to give me this final point, even though I'm being shown a sign that says your time is up. But let me go on for just a couple of minutes. You aren't going to do anything terrible to me. My sixth and final point is a direct answer to that question which frames this conversation. Is Christianity harmful or beneficial to the environment? Obviously, the answer is yes. You're supposed to laugh because that it's both. It's harmful or beneficial? Well, yes. Christians and Christian communities have, like pretty much all humans, have done great harm, far beyond our simple need to live. The more our science and technology improves, the more harm we are capable of doing. The right name for that harm is sin. The right response is repentance. I recently heard of a Christian thinker, interestingly, in terms of White's argument, he was a Franciscan, who has called for the regular practice of eco-penance, repentance for sins against the gifts of the ecosphere. But we humans are also capable of being beneficial to the earth. The word actually means blessing. It has the same Latin root as benediction. How can humans be a blessing to the earth? The basic human response to the mysterious gift of the created world, what we are rather lamely calling the environment, is wonder, awe, and thankfulness. Out of this basic response flow three activities which are unique to human beings. One is worship, our expression of thanks for the gift of being. Another is art, our response to the gift of creation with our own creativity. The third is science, our ability to know. Unfortunately, the delight of that knowledge is all too easily subverted by our technology into mere efficient consumption. But that science, which has deep roots in Christianity, can also be a blessing. I have a friend in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. His name is Eric Higgs. His work centers on the concept of restorative ecology. How can we humans begin to set right the damage we have done? When I told him I was coming down to Oregon State University, he asked me to greet a friend of his, Alan Thompson, a philosopher who was doing important work in applying the idea of virtues to the changing planetary situation. It seems to me that that very concept of restorative ecology takes us to the threshold of theology. Restorative is a word that means something very close to salvation. Likewise, the work which Alan has done on what virtues are needed for the time ahead takes us to the threshold of asking these big theological questions. When a Christian prays the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," they are, it seems to me, praying for the restoration of God's shalom, that harmony between Creator, creation, and creation's most problematic inhabitant, we human beings. I'd like to respectfully conclude by suggesting that that work on restorative ecology and on virtues which underlie it can perhaps best be understood from within the framework provided by the Christian story. That we are given the immense privilege of being part of the Creator's healing work, and thus beneficial, a benefit, a blessing for creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wilkinson. I'd like to have a quick reminder of the audience. Make sure your cell phones are on silent, please, out of respect for the rest of the audience and also the speaker as well. Our second speaker tonight is Dr. Alan Thompson. Dr. Thompson is a professor of philosophy here at OSU. Before teaching at Oregon State, Dr. Thompson was on faculty at Clemson University in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. Here at OSU, he teaches courses in ethics, environmental ethics, and classical moral theories. His research interests include environmental philosophy, social and political philosophy, and practical reason. Dr. Thompson's publications include Ethical Adaptation to Climate Change, a book published by MIT Press, and Natural Goodness and Abandoning the Economy of Value, a journal article published in Ethics, Place, and Environment. Dr. Thompson has also taken part in NPR's Philosophy Talk, wherein he gave a talk on the moral cost of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Alan Thompson.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming this evening. I need a moment, and I've learned that it's quite a different program than you're accustomed to have the screen come down at the Socratic Club. And is this still on? It goes off and on a little irregularly. I noticed that in Lauren's presentation. I think that it's just a kind of inconsistent connection. People suffer through this. I do want to, like Lauren did, give my thanks to the Socratic Club generally, particularly Gary Fruger and my colleague, and Peter Kilgore, the president, also Matt Rubin for first inviting me here this evening, and Lauren Wilkinson, also my interlocutor, and for the nice things he's just said about my work in connection with tonight's topic. Let's see if I can get this going. It's all working before. Oh, fantastic. Thank you. All right. Let's see if I can find a little room here. First, I want to say a little something about the thesis as advertised on this talk, just very quickly. Is Christianity? I think it's the placement. What do you know? Maybe that's better. I just think it's not a good connection or something. I'm not sure. I'm sorry about this. Yeah.
So, was mine as bad as his?
I think maybe, let me hold it like this. I think it's something about the antenna being tucked away.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm feeling a little more confident. I think it's okay. I think okay. Okay. Good. I want to say just a little something about this framing, and I sure would be a brazen man to come before you and say, indeed, taking the composition, my thesis is Christianity is harmful to the environment. And that is not my thesis this evening, just so you know. I prefer a different framing, as is in some of the advertisements. Is Christianity helpful or a hindrance to sound environmental stewardship? Can it be positively contributory, or is it some sort of drag slowing down the work that we all know that we need to do, and that largely we're all on board here with? My position will be largely non-committal on this. It could be either. It's not inherently contrary or contributory to the problem. It's not uniquely helpful or problematic of all sorts of ideological worldviews or world religious views. I endorse instead a practical pluralism. And this is the view that any reasonable scheme or metaphysical framework that promotes protective environmental legislation should be welcome. So whatever our metaphysical outlook is or our religious orientation, as long as we have convergence on some of the same policy goals, which many of us do, independent of our ideological backing, we should have a big tent and be welcome. Welcoming. We're asked to talk a little bit about the Lynn-White thesis. The question put to me was, what is the Lynn-White thesis, and does it support the claim that Christianity is antithetical to sustainable environmental stewardship? So really the most influential formation on contemporary environmental ethics of the Lynn-White thesis, in my reconstruction, is the following sort of argument. Anthropocentrism is the ideological driver of the environmental crisis. I'll define it in a moment, but anthropocentrism is fundamentally the idea that it's only human beings who have an intrinsic moral value. And this is then the words of Lynn-White that Lauren was emphasizing, that the rest of creation, the rest of the non-human world, has a mere instrumental value to be put to our ends. That's the view of anthropocentrism. The diagnosis is that anthropocentrism is the kind of ideological framework that's the driver of the environmental crisis. Christianity, then, as a major ideological worldview, is the most anthropocentric of all world religions. This would lead us to the conclusion, then, that Christianity is the ideological driver of the environmental crisis, bearing the tremendous guilt, as Lauren also interpreted the argument. This is the definition of anthropocentrism. Only human beings have intrinsic moral value. It's also a bit of interpreting the world through our human value lens or scheme for seeing the world. How could we do otherwise? But it turns out that anthropocentrism, for a lot of reasons I can't go into here, is really not the best diagnosis of the ideological root of our environmental crisis. It's an ambiguous sort of term. It means a good deal of different things. There's an ontological thesis about not putting man in the center of the universe, which was put out by Copernicus and Galileo and these sorts of views. And then there's an ethical thesis, but it involves a good number of problems. Really, there are better terms in our philosophical lexicon. Speciesism is the first. Right? Speciesism is the discrimination on the basis of species when species is not the morally relevant criterion. Often we treat non-human animals, despite the pain and suffering that we know this brings them, in a way as though that pain and suffering did not count whatsoever, or is radically discounted from the pain that we humans undergo under similar circumstances. And it's not obvious how that this could be morally justified. Also, a certain kind of human chauvinism is a bit more precisely the diagnosis of the attitudes that stand behind our treatment of the non-human world. This is discrimination against non-humans on grounds which are not rationally justified. Speciesism is always wrong, and human chauvinism is a bit more problematic. It's a kind of resetting the goalposts all the time to keep all and only human beings the most important, and this is a kind of morally problematic position. So, for reasons I really can't go into here, my claim is that parts of anthropocentrism are in fact unavoidable. And like our thinking through our value scheme and framework, if we try to strip ourselves entirely of values that are unintelligible to humans, we can't do anything. The ethics must speak to us, and our values are clearly a human value scheme. And also, some of it may in fact be ethically desirable, which you're not entirely going to. But this brings us to a kind of conclusion concerning the Lynn-White thesis. If anthropocentrism is widely a misunderstood problem, as I've indicated that I believe it is, then it simply will not matter that Christianity is the most anthropocentric of religions. That can be true still. And I don't have to engage with that thesis. Right? If it is, and if indeed Lynn-White is correct about that, that it holds the rest of the world as merely instrumental, and this underwrites our dominating attitudes towards it and our misuse of it, this simply isn't a problem if anthropocentrism isn't the underlying problem of the environmental crisis, and Christianity then is sort of off the hook, as it were, even if it is the most anthropocentric view. I'd like to revisit Lynn-White's thesis, though, put in other terms. The roots of our ecological crisis lie in our Judeo-Christian idea that humanity is to dominate, in the sense of control and subdue, nature. God, this thing made me nervous. Too many things going on up here. So what does environmental stewardship mean? I'm going to switch gears a little bit and come back around to this question of the reading of Lynn-White's thesis about domination over nature. Stewardship itself as a term could be misleading. A steward is someone who is tasked with managing another's property. It's a person whose responsibility it is to take care of something. Now, I don't want to beg the question about ownership. Right? That is necessarily...
Just step back. You're in the ring.
Thanks.
You should be good. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I don't want to beg the questions of ownership, that the world of creation belongs to God in some sense, and we owe it, as a steward, has to take care of the bags of someone getting on the ship, something like this, right? I'd like to focus a little bit more on the notion of moral responsibility, that a steward is the responsible party for something or another. So, as Lauren indicated, there are at least two readings of Genesis, the dominion sort of interpretations, and the first is this sort of license to conquer from Genesis 1, lines 26 through 29. God said, "Let us make man in our own image," these are some paraphrasing, "and let them be masters of the fish in the sea," and so on. God blessed them, saying to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth, and conquer it. Be masters of all the fish in the sea," in this sort of language. This obviously more strongly supports the charge to dominate nature, that man has a license to dominate, control, and subdue nature, and this is a command coming, an imperative coming from God. Although in the second Genesis, line 15 in particular, as we cited already, we get a different grounds for an interpretation that's more in line with care and cultivation. Yahweh God, quote, took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and take care of it. This supports a more responsive and responsible type of oversight. I'm going to have to pick it up here a little. So do we have a moral responsibility to be good stewards of the earth? And if so, what's the reason that we bear this responsibility? Do we have a moral responsibility? Well, divine appointment is one way to answer yes. Right? And it's one way to interpret a good kind of stewardship, leaning on this interpretation from Genesis 2 of care of creation, rather than a despotic position. But certainly, an owner or a kind of command from a supernatural being that we care for this thing in a particular kind of way are reasonable grounds to understand that we thereby have a responsibility to do this. That's what we're trying to unpack. My position is really, in the end, not all that different from Lauren's, I think, regarding the substantive stance we want to take. It's really just whether God plays an essential or ineliminable role in this. I want to explore a little how a secular perspective could justify the claim that human beings have a moral responsibility to be good stewards. So yes, I claim we do have an obligation for responsible stewardship, but why? One kind of answer is that our obligation may be based on the moral status, that is the intrinsic value of features of the non-human world in other individual organisms, species of organisms, or ecosystems or particular places, parts of the non-human world, as is explained here. This is to take the sort of traditional environmental ethics approach of a non-anthropocentric view, attributing intrinsic value to the natural world. It's because it has a moral standing in some sense that we have obligations to it for care and responsible oversight. Another kind of avenue a secular humanist could take is to say that the obligation is based on the moral status of future generations of human beings. This does not require a problematic attribution of an intrinsic value to parts of the non-human world. It will allow us to remain believing that human beings are the only bearers of a kind of morally intrinsic value. But it turns out there are some well-known philosophical problems understanding how it could be that we could even possibly harm future human beings. And I don't want to go too far astray in this quickly, otherwise it's known as Derek Parfit's non-identity problem, a little bit of a technical philosophy. And it turns out that the idea is the policies that we set today, slowly as they unfold, change the human beings who come into existence as society rearranges itself around these policies. And if you give this long enough time, a different group of human beings will come into existence than would have been brought into existence had we chosen some other policy today, a couple hundred years out. And on the presumption that it's better to exist than not to exist, the people who come into existence because of our poor environmental policy choices really don't have any claims against us that we've harmed them, because it's better to come into existence than not. And if we had chosen the more environmentally protective policies, they wouldn't have come into existence at all.